I mean, he's the same place every week. What's he confused about?
Oh, she must have left.
We see you.
All right.
All right.
Okay.
Good morning. We are in Acts chapter 21. Acts chapter 21. Starting in verse 17. Scott is out of town, so Joe and I are sitting up here today and going to lead us in thought and look forward to our discussion together. I don't know who has mics because John Dean took care of that. Does anybody have mics is the question. Looks like no. Huh? So they gave mics. Oh, Benny's got one.
Crystal?
Crystal has one back there? Okay. Yeah, okay, so John's busy. Benny, you're the only male that got a mic that decided to enter the auditorium. So that means you get to lead us in prayer.
Our Holy Father, we thank you so much for this new day you've given us, this first day of the week, a beautiful day that it is. We are thankful for the opportunity to gather together and study your word this morning, and later to worship you, praise you for the good God that you are. Pray that you be with us in both cases. Help us to put away worldly thoughts and to think about ways that we can be closer to you and more like Jesus every day, Father. Be with Terry and Joe as they lead our thoughts this morning, and help us to check the scriptures and to make proper applications to our life, Father. These things we pray in Christ's name. Amen.
All right, so like I said, we're in chapter 21, and we are in Jerusalem. Here starting in verse 17, when we had come to Jerusalem. And this starts a section that's a pretty lengthy section, actually. It's going to go through chapter 26. And it's really interesting to think about that, Joe, that within about a chapter, we cover 2 years in Ephesus almost. Mm-hmm. And then about 5 chapters to cover what is also 2 years. This stay in Jerusalem before he goes to Rome is going to last about 2 years. But one of the things to understand is in tonight's lesson, Paul is no longer a free man, essentially, even in Jerusalem. He's going to get arrested in today's lesson, and he's going to remain arrested throughout the section of his stay in Jerusalem. And that's important, I think, to kind of have in our minds before we go any further, that we normally think of house arrest and such things as being his time in Rome, but that's also what's going on here.
Yeah, and actually it's a good thing that he gets arrested here. It's either that or get beaten to death.
Right, it's either that or be stoned, probably.
Yeah.
And it's really important. And then we'll see the providence of God, I think, in part of this, some things that happen here. But he comes here, and one of the things I just want to quickly touch on, I told Joe to start with this, and we'll see it a couple times, is there is some unrest in Jerusalem when he gets there. And it's largely between the Jews and Rome. There's some, and a lot of it has to do with Felix, who is the proconsul at this time. His response to some things and putting to death people at different times. He actually has a pretty bloody trail as the leader of the region there. And so that's a part of the picture we need to understand, that there has been, and we'll see a reference a little bit to one of these, there's been some rebellion against Rome in Jerusalem already. Now that's going to heighten about 67 AD, but it's starting to ramp up in the mid-50s, and that plays a role in all of this, because what that does is that really has this kind of undercurrent of Jews versus Gentiles in the city at this time. And that's going to play a role in what all we read today. So that's really important to kind of keep in mind in that sense. And a lot of that, by the way, is from Josephus. That I was telling Joe, Josephus has a lot of information, whether it's in war or antiquities, that really helps us understand this kind of period with a little extra biblical text and gives us maybe some clarity about some of those things. So they come to Jerusalem, and the first thing I just wanted to ask you real quick is, do you remember why we said that he wants to come to Jerusalem and why he went the route that he went? What was one of the major reasons for that? I've taught this is the third week in a row, so I remember that.
Johnny?
So, John?
It's the bring a collection from
Right.
the churches that he's been working in to the Christians in Jerusalem that are really suffering.
Right. And the most notable reference of that is to Corinth, right? We know that's part of that. You know what's missing in your reading today? What's that?
That.
That, yeah. There's
They don't
no
mention.
reference to that at all, which seems odd, right? Because there has been references to this, and now there's no reference. Now, why do you think that is? Anybody have any ideas? No one? Never thought about that? No?
I've got a small theory. It's just, well, that's not part of my theory, but the theory is that there's a lot of people who are, who've been given specific tasks of taking this contribution and this, and so there's a lot of accountability already built into it. So Luke just assumes going forward that with that level of accountability, that it just happens. That doesn't carry it doesn't move the story forward where he's going with what's going to happen to Paul, which is really the main thing, and that's where he lands on it. So that's.
Yeah, there's three theories that are generally put forward. One is that it wasn't delivered, which does not seem likely, right? One is that the gifts were rejected by the Jerusalem church because it made them feel less than. I think that is unlikely. The most probable of the normal theories suggested is this, that the collection was delivered, but because of all the things going on, you could say it's unimportant like Brandon did, but the general idea is it's just not received in the same way maybe Paul had expected, is usually the theory put forward, just because there's so much unrest that's more important. And we know that the unrest is present and they're aware of it because they have an arrangement already in place for Paul to participate in before he gets there in order to try to accept Paul as a teacher. And so the idea here is just the idea that kind of more what Brandon says, I think, is based on the other things going on, it's not what is of value. And this ties into what Joe says, is Luke is going to start a storyline going forward where that's not important. The storyline really becomes Paul. In fact, what you see here is in verse 17 is Luke says, when we had come to Jerusalem, the brothers received us gladly, and that's the last time you see the pronoun we. It switches to a complete and almost tunnel vision on Paul until chapter 26, which is the elimination of all these other things. Now, remember that when Paul comes in, keep this in mind, that when Paul comes in to Jerusalem with this gift, there are these other people, and they're Gentiles that are sent with Paul. So put that in the context of everything. Here comes Paul with his merry band of Gentiles to a church that's got some issues because of what Paul's doing with the Gentiles. And that's what's going on when we get there.
So that's cause number one, or that's the leadership there accepts Paul and his work wholeheartedly.
Yeah, this
But-
is not that Acts 15 is not being followed by
Right,
the leadership. To
right.
be clear,
Yeah.
they are. You see James and the elders in agreement.
Mm-hmm.
It's the other people, and specifically new converts they mentioned there.
And also the way the Greek reads is that it's the group it's the church as a whole are zealous about the law, and it's not it would include new converts, but this has been going on. We're at about AD 58, approximately 57,
58, yeah.
58 at this
Yeah.
point in time, and so if you have Pentecost at AD 30, which is one of the kind of a middle date there. But 30 to 33, this has been going on a long time, and they're firmly entrenched. Brandon?
The only thing that maybe you can kind of is that when they first get to town, the next day when they see the elders, they take the 4 men with Paul and they say, go and pay for them to have their vow. That's the only kind of inference that I can see, that there's some money, maybe part of the money that Paul brought is some of this vow money. When they tell him, go to the temple, pay for these men. It does say that they were received with gladness, but what my point is that money is not significant in the grand scheme of things. Kind of like what Terry was saying, and I hate to say this today, but today it's the same way. Money for the church is kind of like grease on the gears to make things go. But it should never be the focus of what being a Christian is all about. It's important, it's necessary, but what being a Christian is about is talking to people, is spreading the gospel, and that's what gets focused on here, is the gospel, the good news, and its significance, and that's why I think that the money's just not that important. Now, did they use it? Yeah, I think they used it. I think they brought it. I think that's, when it says here in verse 22, what's to be done? They'll certainly hear that you've come. Therefore, do what we tell you. To have 4 men who've made a vow, take these men, purify yourselves, pay for them to get their heads shaved. Everybody knows what you're going to do. But money's not important. It's not important today, other than just to get stuff done, and it should not be the focus of what worship is all about. To me, that's just me.
This is not saying it's the focus. I think the main thing to take from here is that gift is a benevolent aid, which is a part of what the church should be doing, and it is important. It's not about money. It's about the care and the fellowship between brethren. And I think what we need to realize is that does take place, but Luke is telling a story. He's not telling the whole story, right? He's not telling everything that happens. He's telling what he needs to tell the story he wants to tell. And the story that he introduced earlier, and this is what you got to also put this in the context, is Paul's going to Jerusalem to go to Rome. How's he going to make that happen? By getting arrested? And if you think about it, from the time he's introduced the idea of going to Rome, everybody who's seen Paul has said what about going to Jerusalem?
Don't go.
Don't go to Jerusalem. And Paul goes anyway. Why? That's how he's going to get to Rome. And Luke is telling the story to show how he gets from Ephesus to Jerusalem to Rome.
Yeah.
That's the point of the story. Now, the second thing is, I cannot see, and I'm going to tie this back to David, to think that Paul took the money that was meant for benevolence to pay for this vow would be like David taking the land for free for the temple. I just don't see that something as Paul would do. He would, because of what's at stake, and we'll talk more about that here, that's his money he uses, because that is and especially as a Jew of the Jews, right, as he describes himself, right, he understands that whatever he offers in that moment should be his. The money's not significant. It's just an interesting turn, and the real point of that is to show that the story has changed. Yep. That's the point of all of this.
That's where Luke is going with this, is that the story's taken a new directive, and that's going to Rome, and it kind of breaks off at this point. But there's another thing that Luke's going to assume some things that you're going to believe this, because a man who's even willing to die in Jerusalem rather than accomplish the mission of, and he's already said, if I die in Jerusalem, I'm paraphrasing, but it's okay.
Right.
That's not the kind of man that takes the money out of the collection and puts it in his pocket. And so Luke just moves forward going, we've got these very reputable people that have taken a collection. That gets taken care of. That's just in the background at this point.
And the other thing is the gospel is shared, but only in the context of defense as you go forward. From here to chapter 26,
it's all defense.
It's all legal proceedings. Everything has to be viewed from the standpoint of legal proceedings. And
Even-
what is really interesting
Yeah.
is the way Paul does that. Paul defends his faith and shares his story and talks about his transition from Judaism to Christian when he's in front of Jews. But when he is in front of the Romans, he does not do that. And it's interesting to see that. And part of that's because of the timing and the legal defense.
And actually, and it's not the legal side of it, it's the brotherly side of it, but the defense begins right away.
Yeah.
And that's the elders have come to the conclusion that the best way to handle this with the congregation or with the group or groups there in Jerusalem, the best way to handle Paul's reputation that he's not doing the things that he's being accused of is to put him through this vow process. And what's interesting, if we go back to chapter 18, Paul has already entered into a vow. 18:18 tells us that he's cut his hair. And Terry went down the historical side on this, and I went down the vow side, taking a look at it. And the Mishnah says you can cut your hair, which was weird when I read it. It says, why is he cutting his hair in Synchrea? It says at the entrance to the tabernacle. That's where you offer your hair, and they would burn it there as you ended the Nazirite vow. But the Mishnah says if you were in the diaspora, if you were away, you could cut your hair anywhere, but then you brought it to Jerusalem, and then you offered it there at the temple.
Well, there's also, and we'll get into this in a minute, but there's also a 7 days purification if you've been in a diaspora,
Yeah.
you've been in another country, an unclean land.
Yeah,
To enter the temple, you have to purify for a 7-day period.
right.
And that's separate from the Nazirite vow.
Here's
which is
the
interesting.
other thing about the vow. We think, okay, well he's got to buy a lamb for these 4 guys. Well, actually, the way they did it was there were 6 offerings. There was a ram, a ewe, a lamb. Those were all the animal offerings, and then unleavened bread, grain, and wine.
And that would be for each of the 4
Each
men.
of the 4. So now you're talking about Paul. You think, okay, that's a sacrifice.
Yeah, it's a
And,
lot. Here,
Yeah, and this may be trivial, but he doesn't write about, like, where's Peter? Is he dead now, or any
yeah, one of
other
the interesting things here is none of the
None of the
apostles are mentioned.
apostles,
And we
yeah.
don't know where they're at, but it does seem that they're not in Jerusalem. Or some have suggested that even if they're there, James has become kind of the leader of the group.
Call it out for the former.
But
rather than
I think they're both gone. In fact,
Original James is dead.
this is James, the brother of Jesus.
Okay.
And the assumption is that when it talks about elders, it's kind of loosely patterned after probably the Sanhedrin because that's their history. But here's this group of, not 70, but this group that sits in that same kind of way to make judgments. And they've made this judgment. I mean, the rumor is that Paul's out there telling the Gentiles to completely deny the law of Moses and not to circumcise their children. And not just them, but the Jews in those areas. More importantly, the Jews in those areas. And telling the Jews to deny Moses and all of those things. And what's interesting is that the response to that is them to say, we know you don't do that. And that's essentially what they're saying here. We know that you're not doing that. And so that brings up then, they have already made arrangements. I'm not sure Paul's under the Nazirite vow. I think there's a couple of explanations for what he's doing. But we know that these 4 guys are at the Nazirite vow because they're going to have their hair cut and they're going to have all these things. And that process took 7 days. As Joe pointed out, that's the different sacrifice. And the process for Paul, and this is why I say it may not be a Nazirite vow for him, the process for Paul from coming from another place to enter the temple was also 7 days. And so that the idea here is at the very least, if Paul's not under Nazirite vow, at the very least, the 5 of them could end their purification period together simultaneously, and Paul is carrying the financial charge for all of that. Now, why would they do that? Why is this the suggestion? Okay, to appease the Jews? I mean, if the charge from the Jews is that he's telling Jews not to be Jews anymore, this is a way for Paul to physically and symbolically say, Well, that's not true.
And what is the most contrite act that a Jewish person can enter into in the Torah is to take the Nazirite vow.
Yeah.
And so if he upholds the most sacred part of that Jewish process, or that Jewish, if he upholds that, then he ends all the rumor. And it's a really wise decision by the elders. We don't get the impression that the Holy Spirit is speaking here to the, like back in 15 when the council, the Jerusalem council, that the Spirit is definitely involved in that process. But here it seems to be they're just using their judgment to arrive at that point.
I just think it's odd. I mean, he gets on to Peter about pandering to the Jews. And here he is pandering to the Jews.
It's not odd when you read 1 Corinthians 9 that it says, to the Jews
Yeah,
I became
I
a
mean,
Jew, and to the Greek a Greeks. I mean, it's not odd at all when you think about what he's actually said. He doesn't get on to Peter for pandering to the Jews. He gets on to Peter for being a hypocrite to the Gentiles in front of the Jews. Those are two wildly different things. Because what Peter does is he practices racism as a way of pandering to the Jews. He commits a sin as a way of pandering to the Jews. That's why he scolds Peter. Paul's not committing a sin here. What he does here is not sinful. And I think that's really important to understand in the context. And I think this is hard for us to understand. And I'm sure this is something that if we don't bring it up, somebody else will. But observing the temple practices and keeping the Jewish law and even observing the feast is not sinful. It's not sinful for them to do that. There's no requirement for them to reject that. And I think that's important for us to understand. Now, the important part of that is, I mean, truthfully, I think Paul's view of this, of the keeping of the Torah, could be summed up that Paul views it as a matter of indifference largely, and because there's an awareness that that is not something that is your salvation bears upon, the keeping of the Torah. That's the real distinction, is that in Acts 15, the idea there is you cannot be in a covenant with God unless you're circumcised and keeping the law. And the council says that's not true. Abstain from idols, right? And be clean, and that's the idea that is presented there. But the Jews are not banned from going to the temple. They're not told. Nowhere do we see the Jews are unable to observe the feast. In fact, what we've seen here is him staying in a place in order to observe the Passover, and him wanting to get Jerusalem, it appears, in time for Pentecost. Like, all of those things are there. Paul intends to still observe the feast days.
And that helps to explain Romans 14.
Correct.
You have the Jews coming back into Rome after Claudius had kicked them out a few years prior. And so now you've got Gentile Christians who've been there, and the churches have been running according to all Gentile converts, and the Jews are coming back. And so 14 deals with, some of you are going to have principles about observing certain days, and some of you are going to go, and God says, you're both right. Do what your conscience says to do by faith. And
as long as you don't cause someone else to stumble in the process, or yourself to stumble.
Right. And so the automatic assumption from this is that a Jewish family observing Torah in a church in a church following Jesus in Rome is not a stumbling block. I mean, it's just they would recognize that's the cultural background, and that is Torah, and so. There's hard questions in here, like, you know, how are they dealing with Hebrews? Well, we don't even know. Hebrews is not written at this point, so we won't. And Romans predates this, so they're hard questions. I can't answer them. Yeah. I'm assuming Terry can't answer all of them
but
either.
Part of the key is you're not binding the law.
Well, exactly.
That's the key. Is you're not binding it on anyone. You're not binding the requirement to not observe the law on anyone. I think a good comparison to this for us today would be Christmas, because for a lot of us, we grew up probably with a culture that not only disparaged the idea of Christmas, but really labeled Christmas, anybody who observed Christmas, to be sinning, because if God didn't command it, it must be sinful, right? And then, I don't know about other people, but for me, I grow up and I read Romans 14 that says if a man wants to observe a day, he can observe a day. And suddenly it's like, wait a minute. That's not how I was raised, right? Now the difference is when we start binding that on everybody. What you do at your home on December 25th is your business with your family. But when you start holding people to a line of fellowship based on that, now you've crossed the line. That's the same thing here. And the accusation that Paul is telling people they cannot observe the law would be Paul crossing the line of the very thing he writes in Romans 14. That's really important, I think.
And he doesn't do that.
He doesn't do that. Yes, Brandon?
Well, like he's talking about going to Hebrews, the part about the law being fulfilled, and then essentially the end of the ability to live up to the law, to be able to sacrifice in Jerusalem the way that it's prescribed in the law. The Christians aren't going to end that. The Romans are going to end that. And
12 and a half years, it's going to be over.
That's
God
right.
is going to end that.
That's what I mean. God takes care of it through the
Yeah.
Romans by the destruction, and
and he's maintained
it's a
that.
transition period. It's unique in this period of time. I think we do have a difficulty understanding that most of these devout Christians that were Jewish, they probably still did go to the temple. They sacrificed, probably. We don't know. I mean, but there's nothing wrong with it.
But it's interesting here the leaders are involved in arranging a Nazirite vow within the temple rules, which seems to point to that.
Christianity to them was, an extension of Judaism. It's the completion of Judaism. It's the fulfillment of Judaism.
Right.
That's normal, I think.
Yeah, and I think the key here is to understand that like you said, God is going to take care of all this in AD 70 when the temple's destroyed. And even today he's taking care of that, because in Jerusalem the most significant piece of property is run by Palestinians and Muslims. And it's a mosque where the temple was. By the way, I don't think that's coincidental. I think that's providential. God's making sure, we normally say it this way, that the Jewish economy cannot exist without a temple.
Yeah, Hebrews 8:13, saying a new covenant, he has declared that the first was obsolete and growing old is about to pass away. And that's,
Right.
It does. And
I say this at the risk of being stoned, and for these 30 or 40 years, there was never a sermon in Jerusalem, for sure, and probably throughout all of Christianity, about the 5 acts of worship.
Well, that's true.
It's just that does not take place in the early church. But having said that, I'm not minimizing that there are acts of worship, but there's certainly more than 5. But
Yeah, look, and the thing to understand is what they're trying to do to get back to this is to make it so it's safe for Paul. Now, the problem is, as we try to move forward in the 20 minutes we have left, is that as they're trying to make things safe for Paul, and he's going through this, as the 7 days are almost over, we're told, and he's in the temple, and by the way, when he's in the temple, we're saying, based on the context, he's inside the court of the Gentiles. He's proceeding, it seems like, to the inner court. This is the end of the 7 days. He's on his way with these 4 men to finish this process. Get the picture. This is moments before all of this is done. And there's Jews from Asia that show up.
yeah, which is the priest going, these men have completed. I mean, it's a ceremonial thing, because all the sacrifices have occurred.
Right. This is moments from them declaring them clean, pure, finished,
Right.
vow kept. And they see him, and they make really 2 charges. What's the first charge these men make? That's the second one. The first one is the same charge that they said in verse 21 that the elders and James say, this is what's being said about you. The second one is that he's brought in foreigners where?
Into the temple.
And what does he mean by that? Yeah, past the gate, the wall, the inner wall between those two courts is about 4.5 feet tall. They did it that way so to make sure the Gentiles could see in and know they were kept out.
And they also had these signs.
Yeah, about every 20 feet, there's these huge signs that say, if you come in here, we're going to kill you.
Yeah.
And by the way, they could. Rome allowed the temple guard to guard the temple. But at the same time, over on the western side of the temple, there's also this huge fortress with these two massive staircases, and inside of there is 1,000 troops. Okay? And one rough breakdown I saw that was like about 760 infantry and about 240 cavalry, right? Inside of that building, and there's one man over all that. Well, that was built because during the feast days, that allowed them with all the people there to make sure there were no riots and nothing was going on. Okay? That was the main purpose. But what happens here is things get so out of hand in all of this where they're dragging Paul out. They get him out of the inner courtyard. They shut the gate on the inner courtyard so no blood can be spilled in the temple and profane the temple. That's why they do that.
You've been doing the chronological reading. You've read about these were the gatekeepers. So that there are certain priests assigned to opening and shutting the gates of the various sections of the temple.
And they are taking Paul out to kill him. That's what they're going to do. Because if he had brought a Gentile into the inner courts, that's the penalty, according to the Torah, is death. But it's such a riot at this time. And the picture's painted that people are pouring in from outside the temple now. Because, I mean, this thing is getting out of hand, that the tribune, which is the head of those 1,000 troops, and these troops come storming down the steps, and they seize control of Paul. Now, this is an important point in the story because this guy essentially is the reason why Paul stays alive to get to Rome. This tribunal, when he comes down, he talks to Paul. When he finally talks to Paul, and we'll see that in a moment, he's the reason Paul gets to live. Without the Roman guards, Paul dies here.
Or God intervenes some other way.
Or God intervenes some other way. Yeah. But this is the way God intervenes. And this is the start of what will take him eventually to invoke his citizenship to go to Rome, which has been his goal the whole time.
That's where he thinks he's an Egyptian.
There's a reason for that.
Yeah.
Because, John, real quick.
Would it be safe to say that Paul's okay dying here? He's kind of said it in the last
Oh,
chapter.
yeah,
that he's okay dying here,
He
and
said that.
he's
He
gonna
said that.
he's gonna see this as a gain for Christ if that's what happens.
Right,
So
he
he's
said
really
that.
not fighting it
Yeah, he's not. No, in
to a
fact,
point for his life.
In fact, when he mentions his citizenship here in a moment, that's not his Roman citizenship. He's just mentioning being a citizen of Troas. It takes a while for him to say that he's a Roman citizen. That's really interesting. Because he could have said it right here and it'd be over. Like if he had said if he invoked the Roman citizenship here when they lay hold of him, everything's shut down. They cannot imprison him. He is free to go.
And they probably arrest some of the Jews and put them on crosses.
Correct.
As a result of beating a Roman citizen without a trial.
Because the other thing is, his word as a Roman citizen versus the word of these Jews from Asia, his word trumps them just because he's a citizen. So he doesn't do any of that. And that's really important. Okay? But let's get to the thing here. When he comes here and they finally get him away, it's so bad that they have to carry him above the crowd to get him into the barracks. He accuses him of being this Egyptian. And the reason for that is that about 2 years earlier, I think, about 54, 55 in that area, an Egyptian claiming to be a Messiah comes into Jerusalem leading a rebellion against the Romans. Felix is the governor. And what happens in that moment is that Egyptian causes this rebellion and this riot. at the charge of Felix, 400, and there's a big discrepancy between Josephus and Luke.
Yep.
And this is one of those times where all the commentators just say, well, when that happens, we trust Luke, and that's about all they say. But 400 people are killed by Felix then, and 200 people are taken captive of the Jewish rebels, but the Egyptian gets away. And the assumption here is Paul is that Egyptian coming for round 2. That's the assumption. Does that make sense to everybody? Why that's even mentioned?
Yeah, because he's actually claiming to be a Messiah, and he actually even does that from the Mount of Olives, and that's the area historically where he has part of his following and part of his discourse. But then he escapes into the wilderness out of Jerusalem, so he's still at large and not found, and that's where the Roman mind is going. You must be the Egyptian guy that's already been creating trouble here. And he speaks Greek, which, I would suspect he wouldn't think Jewish right off, even though he's in the temple area.
Yeah, and Greek just means he's educated.
Yep.
Truthfully, because there's a lot of Jews that speak Greek, they just don't speak Greek normally. But the thing here is he then says he's from Tarsus, which is, by the way, a city that's not obscure. Well, Tarsus is a major city. It's a major city of education. And so what he kind of does here is he flexes his Gentile side of things. We really get to the Jews a Jew, to the Gentiles a Gentile here. He flexes the Gentile muscle a little bit. Hey, I'm from Tarsus. I'm a citizen of Tarsus. I was born there. I'm not an Egyptian. And at that, and then he asks for him to speak, that's enough to get this guy to allow him to speak. And this is what's really funny is he hushes the crowd, right? He's talking to this guy in Greek, and then when he starts to speak to the Jews, he speaks in Aramaic.
Or Hebrew?
It's probably, most commentators interpret Hebrew to be Aramaic because that was the language of the day.
Okay.
What the Hebrews would have spoke. And so he speaks in their language instead of the Greek, right? So here to the tribune, Greek, to the people, Hebrew, in their language. And that gets us into chapter 22, where he makes a defense. Does this remind you of any other time in Jerusalem? Anybody else? Jonathan, you're grinning. Do you have... Stephen? Both of their speeches start the exact same way, with brothers and fathers. And we don't have time to get through all of them, but there's a ton of parallels between the two. Both talk about Jesus being set at the right hand of God. There's just a lot of things in here that parallels Stephen's speech.
Which parallels Jesus in the sense that the charge against Jesus is a charge against what Jesus is going to do to the temple. It's a false charge. And same thing with Paul. You don't have the leaders of the Jews involved in this particular. It doesn't seem like you have the leaders involved at this point, but
right.
There's some similarities.
Real quick, I think it's interesting. He flexes his citizenship, but he does it in order to try to convert the people who are trying to kill him.
Correct.
Right.
So what would we do in that situation?
Oh, we only flex our citizenship to avoid suffering.
Right.
Yeah. He incurs more. That's one of the interesting things here. Now, he tells his conversion story, and this is the second recounting of that. Mm-hmm. Chapter 9 is the first. There's not a lot of major distinct differences, although a few, but a lot of them are tailor-made to who he's talking to. Some things that are here is like he points out that everybody saw the light, but only he could hear Jesus. And that's important. So he's got witnesses to the actual experience, but not the conversation. He points out here that Ananias is a devout keeper of the law. And that's not in chapter 9. But think about the setting. He's talking to a bunch of Jews who want to kill him, and he's saying, here's a devout man of the law that came and taught me Jesus. Mm-hmm. Right? So he's doing things throughout here that are really important. One of the things that he does, though, is he really makes Jesus the ruler of the temple in the way that he is presenting this. Because, and I want to just for time make sure we get this and we can come back to other questions or comments. But we're pretty familiar usually with the story of the conversion. But in verse 17, when I returned to Jerusalem, was praying in the temple, I fell into a trance and saw him saying to me, listen, visions in the temple have been used more than once in the law and the prophets to dictate that this is a prophet of God. Mm-hmm. They receive visions in the temple. And so they know that. And he says, so he's getting this vision, make haste, get out of Jerusalem because they'll not accept your testimony. And I said, Lord, they themselves know that in one synagogue after another I'm imprisoned and beat those who believed in you. And when the blood of Stephen, your witness, was being shed, I myself was standing by and approving and watching over the garments of those who killed him. And he said, go, for I will send you far away to the Gentiles. Part of what we need to understand here is not, they get mad about the Gentiles part, but also here's the other side. Jesus appearing to him in a vision in the temple is an acknowledgement from Paul that Jesus is ruling over the temple. And they don't approve of that either, because they don't accept Jesus as God. So there's several layers to this scene that enrage the people. They're really interested in his story up until the point that he says, and that's why I've been sent to the Gentiles.
Yeah. And in Jewish thought, and it's divided here, Jewish thought was not uniform on all aspects. There was the prophet that was to come, and there was the Messiah, and some in a lot of Jewish, in some Jewish circles, that was the same individual, but in a lot they were separate. At the very least, he's making him out to be the prophet here by what he's doing in the temple, by telling him this is what's going to happen. He's prophesying the future in the most holy place on earth, which makes him the coming, at the very least, the coming prophet. So it's something that if you were there as a practicing Jew, that would get your attention has been arrested at this point.
Yeah, your hair is on edge. Mm-hmm. And the really interesting thing is, how do they respond to all of this? They raise their voice and say what? What's that? They say, away with this man.
Away with such a fellow from the earth.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
What we should also realize is when Jesus is before Pilate, they say, away with this man, give us Barabbas. Mm-hmm. And so what we have is the same language used for Paul that was used for Jesus. That's the significance of what they're saying.
And it is saying he does not deserve to live. Like they're shouting at Jesus, crucify him, crucify him. So there are these tie-ins to
But in the language, the away with him is the exact same phrase they say to Jesus, recorded for us, I think, at two different places. So we see a lot of these Stephen and Jesus references here. What you got to know, though, is they still want to kill him. And had he not been taken into Roman custody, they would have. That was their intent. It is the existence of the Roman custody and the Roman tribune that he's going to then, in the coming chapters, go before Felix and go before Agrippa, and he's going to have all of these interactions over the course of about 2 years. But he's going to stay in custody for that entire time, which is really important because that's how he's protected. God is using the imprisonment to protect him. And that's one of the most important, I think, things that we need to kind of establish here. And that will eventually take him to invoking his full citizenship, not just saying I'm a citizen of Tarsus, but I'm a Roman citizen and I have a right to appeal to Caesar. And that's how he's going to get to Rome. Mm-hmm. And so the process starts here. Now keep in mind, this is what Luke's storyline is about at this point. It was about Ephesus, but in Ephesus he mentions going to Rome. He's going to go to Jerusalem, go to Rome. That was the sign. Luke always does these things where he gives us these Easter eggs, and then a chapter later, he starts building upon that Easter egg, and here's how this is mentioned. And that's what's going on here. Is he's gone to Rome. Don't go to Rome, you're going to die. No, I got to go to Rome. Don't go to Rome, you're going to die. I got to go to Rome because that's how, not Rome, Jerusalem. That's how I'm going to get to Rome, is Jerusalem. And so that's why the story takes a turn. That's why there are no Luke in the story. There's no Silas. There's no anybody. It's just going to be Paul till chapter 26, and then we go to Rome. Anything else to add to any of that? Or?
Yeah, I had a question earlier, and it just evaporated on me. It's part of the age process, but
If I just talk long enough, you'll forget.
probably. Probably.
Does anybody else have any questions while Joe tries to remember that one, or comments about any of that? Yeah, Linda? I think there were Christians who were keeping parts of the law of Moses. They're Christians, though.
Yeah.
They're members of the Jerusalem church. Yeah. They're not full random Jews off the street that aren't following Jesus. Yeah. John?
I was just going to say, for me, at this point in the story, it completes the picture of why Paul was picked to be the messenger to the Gentiles. He's got that ability to be protected under this citizenship to really do a lot more than if you compared him with someone like Peter, who really had the first Gentiles converted at Cornelius. But it was Paul that was going to really advance that throughout this land, because he's just got more, I guess, credentials to do it and protection to do it.
So the question was, it just hit me. There's this urgency leading up to these chapters of getting to there by Pentecost, but then that evaporates. Any thoughts on
I think same reason for the
for
evaporation of the gift.
Of the
is
gift,
that
yeah.
The storyline changes. The storyline changes, and we follow this arc of getting to Rome through Roman custody.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And that's what changes. I think one of the things to keep in mind about all of that is like this is all that matters at this moment. The other thing I wanted to say, I appreciate John's comment. I think one of the things to remind ourselves of is that the book of Acts is following the story of Peter and Paul, but there is a lot left out about how the gospel is spread by a host of individuals.
Virtually all the apostles. It's just
Correct.
It just disappears.
It's just that the New Testament follows the life of Peter and Paul. And that's really important. I mean, yes, Paul does great work among the Gentiles, but for all we know, Barnabas is too at the same time, just in a completely different direction. And we read about people who we've never heard about before in churches we've never been introduced before, like in Revelation, that we don't know anything about, because there's a lot of people taking the gospel out to the world. It's not just Peter and Paul and the other 11 apostles that we think of that are the ones doing it. It's everybody. It's the Aquilas and Priscillas and the people who scattered and all of those things. The gospel is being shared by all of the believers and all of the Christians. And that's what's carrying it across the planet, if you will. It's just that the story of the Bible follows Paul. And for good reason. He writes 13 letters that form almost half of the canon of the New Testament. I mean, there's reasons for that. But we need to be mindful of all the other people who are actively spreading the gospel, and not neglect them as well.
Are there other writings that aren't canon?
Oh, sure.
That
Yeah.
follow the
Yeah, they didn't meet the standard of canonization. And, one of the things about that, we're out of time, but one of the things about that is I can't tell you affirmatively one way or another whether they are. I can just tell you that by faith I accept that what I have, God's preserved so I can know.
Right.
And beyond that, I don't think we can assume anymore. There's reasons why they've not been accepted.
Yeah, there's a lot of them second century that were just rejected